Most people believe they understand how the First World War began. A lone assassin in Sarajevo pulls a trigger, an archduke dies, and then, like a row of falling dominoes, the great powers of Europe collapse into the trenches. It is the single most frequently repeated narrative in modern history. It is also, in many respects, one of the most dangerously incomplete ones. Now, I am not here to suggest that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was irrelevant. Of course, it was significant. A single bullet altered the entire trajectory of the 20th century. But here is the reality that most history classes, most documentaries, and most textbooks conveniently gloss over. That bullet struck a world that was already drenched in gasoline. The question that truly matters is not who struck the match, it is who spent the previous 40 years pouring the fuel. And when you follow the money, when you trace the railway contracts, the arms deals, the secret loans, and the colonial land grabs, the story you uncover is far more unsettling than any tale of rogue assassins and alliance diagrams. Because the true origin of the First World War was not really about a dead archduke, or even about rival empires wandering blindly into a catastrophe. It was about capital. It was about markets. It was about who would dominate the raw materials and the trade routes that would define the next century of global power. And that story, the one most historians either minimize or ignore entirely, is the one we are going to tell today. So let us go back, not to 1914, but much further to the decades before the guns ever fired, when the seeds of the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen were being planted quietly. Not in the palaces of emperors, but in the boardrooms of bankers, the offices of arms manufacturers, and the construction sites of a single world-changing railway. To understand how Europe sleepwalked into catastrophe, you first have to understand what Europe looked like in the decades leading up to 1914. And I do not mean what it looked like on a map. I mean what it looked like on a balance sheet. By the 1890s, Europe was experiencing the most explosive period of industrial growth in human history. Germany, unified only since 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, was undergoing an economic transformation that stunned the world. In the span of a single generation, Germany went from a loose collection of agricultural states to the continent's industrial powerhouse. By 1913, Germany was producing more steel than Britain, France, and Russia combined. Its chemical industry dominated global markets. Its engineering firms were the envy of the world, and its population was surging from roughly 41 million at unification to nearly 67 million by the time the war began. Now compare this with Britain. Britain had been the undisputed workshop of the world for over a century. The British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the globe's landmass. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. The City of London was the nerve center of global finance. But Britain's industrial lead was slipping. In 1870, Britain produced nearly a third of the world's manufactured goods. By 1913, that share had dropped to around 14%. Germany, meanwhile, had surged to roughly 15%. The student was overtaking the master, and everyone in London knew it. This was not some abstract economic competition. This was an existential threat to the entire British imperial system. Britain's empire depended on two things: naval supremacy and financial dominance. If Germany could challenge either of those pillars, the entire architecture of British global power would begin to crack. And Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, was determined to challenge both. When Wilhelm II ascended to the German throne in 1898, he inherited a country that his predecessor, Otto von Bismarck, had carefully positioned as a continental power. Bismarck's genius had been restraint. He understood that Germany's geographic position in the heart of Europe, sandwiched between France and Russia, meant that aggressive expansion would invite a coalition of enemies. So Bismarck played the long game. He formed alliances, managed rivalries, and kept Germany out of the colonial scramble that was consuming the rest of Europe. But Wilhelm had no patience for restraint. He was impulsive, insecure, and obsessed with prestige. Almost immediately after taking power, he dismissed Bismarck and launched what became known as Weltpolitik, or world policy. This was not just a slogan, it was a wholesale reorientation of German foreign policy. Germany would no longer be content as a continental power. It would demand its place in the sun, compete for colonies, build a world-class navy, and project power across the globe. And this is where we encounter the first major thing that most historians get wrong. The standard narrative treats Weltpolitik as a product of German militarism, of Prussian aggression baked into the national character. But that framing misses something critical. Weltpolitik was not primarily a military strategy. It was an economic one. Germany's booming industries needed raw materials. Its growing population needed markets, and its capitalists needed places to invest their surplus capital. The colonies that Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had already carved up across Africa and Asia were not just flags on a map. They were captive markets, sources of rubber, tin, copper, oil, cotton, and 100 other resources that industrial economies devoured. Germany had arrived late to this feast, and the table was almost bare. The economist John Atkinson Hobson understood this dynamic better than almost anyone alive at the time. In 1902, he published a landmark work on imperialism that would later influence thinkers from Lenin to Keynes. Hobson argued that the new imperialism of the late 19th century was not driven by national glory or civilizing missions. It was driven by capital, specifically by the problem of surplus capital. As industrial economies matured, the domestic rate of return on investment declined. Wealthy investors needed new frontiers, new markets, and new places to deploy their money at higher rates of return. Colonies provided exactly that. They offered cheap labor, cheap raw materials, and captive consumers who had no choice but to buy from the colonizing power. Hobson was writing about Britain, but the logic applied with even greater force to Germany. German banks, particularly the so-called 4D banks, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, Diskonto Gesellschaft, and Darmstädter Bank, were sitting on enormous pools of capital that needed somewhere to go. And the most ambitious outlet for that capital was a project so audacious, so geopolitically explosive, that it alone could have started a world war. That project was the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. Now, if you have only ever heard one cause of the First World War discussed in school, it was probably the alliance system. If you heard two, you might have also learned about the naval arms race. But the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, one of the most consequential infrastructure projects in modern history, rarely gets the attention it deserves. And that is a deliberate omission, because this railway reveals something uncomfortable about the origins of the war. It reveals that the conflict was not just about national pride or defensive alliances. It was about oil, trade routes, and the future of global empire. The story begins in 1888, the same year Wilhelm II took the throne. A German consortium, led by Deutsche Bank, secured a concession from the Ottoman Empire to build a railway connecting Istanbul to Ankara. This was modest enough, a commercial venture to link the Ottoman capital to the Anatolian interior. But from the beginning, the real vision was far grander. The plan was to extend the railway all the way from Berlin, through the Balkans, across Anatolia, and down through Mesopotamia to Baghdad, and eventually to the port of Basra on the Persian Gulf. Think about what this would mean: a single unbroken railway line connecting the heart of industrial Germany to the Persian Gulf. It would bypass the Suez Canal entirely, a canal that Britain had secured control over in 1875, when Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, with financing from the Rothschild banking family, purchased the Egyptian government's shares. It would give Germany direct overland access to the markets of the Middle East, and critically, to the oil fields of Mesopotamia, which were just beginning to be explored. And this is where oil enters the story in a way that most historical accounts of the First World War completely ignore. In 1908, oil was discovered at Masjid-i-Suleiman in Persia, in what is now modern-day Iran. This was one of the first major petroleum strikes in the Middle East, and it sent shockwaves through every capital in Europe. The British, who had already been transitioning the Royal Navy from coal to oil under the direction of First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, immediately recognized the strategic implications. Whoever controlled Middle Eastern oil would control the fuel that powered modern navies, modern armies, and modern industry. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed in 1909, with the British government eventually taking a controlling stake in 1914, just weeks before the war began. But the oil in Mesopotamia, in the regions around Mosul and Kirkuk, was still up for grabs, and the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, if completed, would place Germany in a position to dominate access to those reserves. Britain viewed this as a direct threat to the Royal Navy's fuel supply, to the Suez Canal's strategic monopoly, and to the entire British position in the Middle East and India. The British were not the only ones alarmed. Russia saw the railway as a German knife pointed at its soft underbelly, the Caucasus and Central Asia. France, which had its own financial interests in the Ottoman Empire and extensive investments in Russian railways and government bonds, saw it as a threat to the delicate balance of power. In fact, by 1914, French investors held approximately 20 billion francs in Russian government bonds, making France the single largest creditor to the Russian state. This was not just an alliance of convenience. It was a financial entanglement so deep that France's economic fate was literally tied to Russia's survival as a great power. So when historians tell you the war was caused by a web of alliances, they are not wrong, but they are describing the symptom, not the disease. Those alliances were not abstract diplomatic agreements. They were underwritten by billions in loans, investments, and trade agreements. The Triple Entente between Britain, France, and Russia was as much a financial bloc as a military one. And the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy was an attempt by the Central Powers to create their own economic sphere that could compete with the enormous financial resources of the Entente. Now let us talk about something else that the conventional narrative gets badly wrong: the arms race. Most textbooks present the pre-war arms buildup as a story of national competition, with each country building more ships and bigger guns to keep up with its rivals. And that is true as far as it goes. But it leaves out the most important characters in the story: the private arms manufacturers who were making fortunes selling weapons to every side. The 25 years before 1914 were what those in the arms industry call a classical period of expansion. And at the center of this expansion were a handful of enormously powerful companies. In Britain, there was Vickers Sons and Maxim and Armstrong Whitworth. In Germany, there was Krupp, the single largest arms manufacturer in the world. In France, there was Schneider Creusot. And here is the part that should make you deeply uncomfortable. These companies did not just sell weapons to their own governments, they sold to everyone. Krupp, the pride of German industry, supplied artillery to Belgium, the Netherlands, Romania, the Ottoman Empire, and even Russia. Vickers, Britain's premier arms maker, sold warships and weapons to Japan, Brazil, Turkey, and several nations that would end up fighting against Britain. Armstrong Whitworth built warships for the Japanese Navy that were later used in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, a conflict that reshaped the balance of power in Asia and directly contributed to the instability that led to the First World War. These were not rogue transactions. They were conducted with the full knowledge and often the active encouragement of their respective governments. The arms trade was one of the most profitable industries in the world, and the companies involved had enormous political influence. Krupp's relationship with the German government was so intimate that the company was essentially a shadow arm of the state. Friedrich Alfred Krupp, who ran the company until his death in 1902, was a personal friend of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser attended Krupp's funeral and delivered the eulogy, and the arms race itself had a self-reinforcing logic that the manufacturers exploited brilliantly. When Britain launched the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a revolutionary new class of battleship that made every existing warship obsolete overnight, it triggered a frenzy of naval construction across Europe. Germany responded with its own Dreadnought program. France, Russia, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and even smaller nations like Greece and the Ottoman Empire all scrambled to build or buy their own dreadnoughts. Between 1906 and 1914, Britain launched 19 dreadnoughts and 9 battlecruisers. Germany launched 13 dreadnoughts and 5 battlecruisers. Each new ship built by one country was used as justification for another country to build more. And every ship that rolled off the slipways generated enormous profits for the arms manufacturers and the steel companies and the shipyards that built them. The German Navy Acts of 1898 and 1900, which authorized the massive expansion of the German fleet, were a bonanza for Krupp and the German shipbuilding industry. The British Naval Defence Act of 1889 and subsequent naval estimates were equally profitable for Vickers and Armstrong. This is what the economists called the unusual market-expanding effect, where production in the armament sector merely calls forth more production. It was a feedback loop of profit and paranoia, and the arms manufacturers were the ones spinning the wheel. But the arms race was not just about navies. On land, the armies of the great powers were growing at a staggering rate. In 1870, the German army had a peacetime strength of roughly 400,000 men. By 1913, it had grown to over 800,000, with the capacity to mobilize nearly 4 million in wartime. France, with a smaller population, maintained an army of roughly 750,000. Russia, the colossus of the East, had a peacetime army of nearly 1.4 million, the largest standing army in the world. And these armies were being equipped with weapons of unprecedented destructive power. The machine gun, which could fire several hundred rounds per minute, had been refined into a devastating instrument of mass killing. Artillery had grown in range, accuracy, and explosive power. Chemical research that would later produce poison gas was already well advanced in both German and French laboratories. The killing machinery was ready. It was just waiting for a reason to be switched on. Now here is where the historiographical debate gets really interesting and really contentious. For decades after the war, the question of who started it was answered simply: Germany did. This was the position of the victorious Allies enshrined in Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, the infamous war guilt clause that forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the conflict and to pay crippling reparations. The logic was straightforward. Germany had given Austria-Hungary the so-called blank check of unconditional support after the assassination. Germany had been the first to declare war on Russia and France. Germany had violated Belgian neutrality. Therefore, Germany was guilty. But in the 1920s and 1930s, a wave of revisionist historians, many of them funded by the German government, began to challenge this narrative. They pointed to Russia's early mobilization, France's desire for revenge after the humiliation of 1871, and Britain's failure to clearly signal that it would intervene. They argued that the war was an accident, a catastrophic failure of diplomacy in which all the great powers shared blame equally. As former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George famously put it, Europe somehow slithered into the boiling cauldron of war. This revisionist view became the dominant narrative for decades. It was comfortable. It absolved everyone of primary guilt. It turned the war into a tragedy without villains, a terrible mistake rather than a calculated act. And then, in 1961, a German historian named Fritz Fischer dropped a bomb on the entire debate. Fischer, a professor at the University of Hamburg, published a book that would become one of the most controversial works of historical scholarship of the 20th century. The German title translates roughly as Reaching for World Power, and its argument was explosive. Drawing on previously unseen documents from the German archives, Fischer argued that Germany had not stumbled into war. Germany had deliberately provoked it. Fischer's key piece of evidence was the so-called September Program, a memorandum drafted by German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg on September 9, 1914, just weeks after the war began. The September Program laid out Germany's war aims in breathtaking detail. It called for the annexation of Luxembourg and parts of Belgium and France. It demanded the creation of a vast customs union under German control, a kind of proto-European union dominated by Berlin. It called for the seizure of French colonies in Africa and the establishment of a continuous German colonial empire across the center of the continent. And it demanded that France be weakened to the point where it could never again rise as a great power. Fischer argued that these were not improvised goals, hastily drafted in the excitement of early military victories. He said they were the logical culmination of decades of expansionist thinking in German political, military, and industrial circles. The September program in Fisher's reading was the smoking gun that proved Germany had wanted this war and had planned for it. The backlash was ferocious. Conservative German historians accused Fisher of betraying his country. Gerhard Ritter, one of the most respected historians in Germany, reportedly broke down in tears while lecturing about Fisher's arguments. The German government actually tried to prevent Fisher from traveling to the United States to present his findings, but Fisher's work could not be suppressed. It opened the floodgates to a new wave of research that revealed the extent to which German industrial, military, and political elites had actively pushed for a confrontation. And here is where Fisher's argument connects to the economic story we have been telling. Because when you look at who was pushing for war in Germany, the fingerprints of capital are everywhere. The Pan-German League, one of the most aggressive pro-war lobby groups in the country, was funded by industrialists and landowners who stood to profit from territorial expansion. Krupp, the arms manufacturer, had obvious financial interests in conflict. Deutsche Bank, the financial engine behind the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, wanted the Ottoman Empire firmly in Germany's orbit. The agrarian Junker class of Prussia wanted new lands in the east to sustain their declining economic position. Fischer's student, Volker Berghahn, later argued that Germany's Weltpolitik had actually been a costly failure by 1914. It had not secured the colonies or the markets that Germany's industrialists craved. It had, however, succeeded in alarming every other great power in Europe and driving them into opposing alliances. By 1914, Germany's leaders were caught in a trap of their own making. They had promised their people a place in the sun, but the sun was setting on the colonial era. The window for expansion was closing. And so, when the crisis in the Balkans erupted in the summer of 1914, Germany's leaders saw it not as a disaster to be avoided, but as an opportunity to be seized. But, and this is crucial, Fisher's thesis, as groundbreaking as it was, is not the whole story. Blaming Germany alone is just as reductive as blaming no one. And this is the second great thing that most historians get wrong. Because if you look at Russia's behavior in the July crisis, you find a government that was just as reckless as Germany's. Russia's decision to mobilize its army on July 30th, 1914, was the single most consequential military decision of the crisis. Russian mobilization meant that Germany faced the nightmare scenario that its military planners had been dreading for decades: a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously. And Russia's generals knew this. They knew that mobilization would force Germany's hand because Germany's only war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, required a rapid strike against France through Belgium before turning east to face Russia. Russian mobilization made German mobilization inevitable, and German mobilization through Belgium made British intervention inevitable. Why did Russia mobilize? Partly out of solidarity with Serbia, partly out of fear that Austria-Hungary would destroy the last independent Slavic state in the Balkans, but also, and this is less often discussed, because Russia's military spending had been growing rapidly, funded in large part by those 20 billion francs in French loans. Russia was in the middle of a massive military modernization program that was scheduled to be complete by 1917. Germany's generals were acutely aware of this. They believed with some justification that if they waited until 1917, Russia would be too strong to defeat. This was the logic of preventive war. Strike now while you still can, before the balance of power shifts irrevocably against you. And then there is France. The conventional narrative presents France as a reluctant participant, dragged into the war by its alliance with Russia. But France's behavior in the July crisis tells a different story. French President Raymond Poincaré, who visited St. Petersburg in late July 1914, appears to have actively encouraged Russia to stand firm against Austria-Hungary. France's military establishment had been planning for a war of revenge against Germany since the humiliation of 1871, when Germany had annexed the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. French war plans, particularly Plan 17, were aggressively offensive, calling for an immediate invasion of German territory. France did not stumble into the war. France had been preparing for it psychologically and militarily for 43 years. And Britain, the supposed defender of Belgian neutrality, the reluctant warrior who only entered the war to uphold international law, Britain's decision to enter the war was not primarily about Belgium. It was about the balance of power. A German victory over France and Russia would have created a single dominant power on the continent, controlling the Channel ports, dominating European trade, and possessing a navy that could challenge British supremacy. Britain went to war because a German-dominated Europe was incompatible with British imperial and financial interests. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, understood this clearly. But he also understood that the British public and the British Parliament would not support a war fought openly for commercial and imperial reasons. Belgium provided the moral justification that Grey needed to bring a divided cabinet and a skeptical public into the war. The violation of Belgian neutrality was real, and it was a genuine outrage. But it was also, in the cold calculus of geopolitics, extraordinarily convenient. So here we arrive at the uncomfortable truth that the conventional narratives, whether they blame Germany or blame everyone equally, both managed to obscure. The First World War was not an accident, it was not a miscalculation, and it was not the work of a single villain. It was the product of a global economic system that had been generating increasingly dangerous pressures for decades. The scramble for colonies, the arms race, the competition for markets and raw materials, the entanglement of finance and foreign policy, the rise of industrial capitalism, and its insatiable demand for growth. These were the forces that made war not just possible, but in the minds of many of the men who made the decisions necessary. The historian Hans-Ulrich Wehler, working at Bielefeld University in Germany, introduced new approaches from the social sciences to understand this dynamic. He argued that domestic politics in the great powers was essentially a struggle between different economic and social groups, and that foreign policy was an extension of those domestic conflicts. Germany's aggressive foreign policy, in Wehler's analysis, was driven by the need to manage internal tensions between the rising industrial bourgeoisie, the declining agrarian aristocracy, and the increasingly restless working class. War served as a safety valve, a way to channel domestic discontent outward and unite a fractured society against a common enemy. This was not unique to Germany. Every great power in Europe was dealing with similar internal pressures. Britain faced the Irish question, labor unrest, and the suffragette movement. France was torn by the Dreyfus Affair and deep divisions between left and right. Russia was haunted by the revolution of 1905 and the growing power of its revolutionary movements. Austria-Hungary was disintegrating under the weight of its own ethnic diversity. In every case, there were powerful voices arguing that war would solve these problems, that it would forge national unity and suppress dissent. And behind all of it, always, was money. The arms manufacturers who profited from every escalation, the bankers who financed the loans that funded the military buildups, the industrialists who needed colonies for raw materials and captive markets, the railway companies that connected the mines to the ports and the factories to the front lines, the insurance companies, the shipping magnates, the steel barons. The war was not fought for them exactly, but it was fought in a world that they had built, a world where economic competition between great powers was understood as a zero-sum game, where one nation's gain was another's loss, and where the ultimate arbiter of economic disputes was military force. The Australian historian Christopher Clark, in his landmark 2012 work called The Sleepwalkers, tried to move beyond the blame game entirely. Clark argued that the war was not caused by any single nation or any single decision. It was the product of a shared political culture in which statesmen across Europe made decisions based on incomplete information, mutual misunderstandings, and catastrophic miscalculations. They were, in Clark's evocative phrase, sleepwalkers, stumbling toward the abyss with their eyes half closed. Clark's argument is compelling, but it has been criticized for going too far in the other direction, for turning the war into something that just happened without anyone really being responsible. The German historian Annika Mombauer has argued that Clark's framing leads to a problematic relativization of responsibility, one that obscures the conscious and deliberate decisions made in Berlin and Vienna to pursue war rather than diplomacy. And this brings us to what I think is the most important lesson of the whole debate. The truth about the First World War is not a single clean narrative. It is layered, contradictory, and deeply uncomfortable. Germany bears significant responsibility for the war, more than any other single power. The evidence for this is overwhelming, but Germany did not act in a vacuum. It acted within a global system that incentivized competition, rewarded aggression, and made war the logical extension of economic policy. The men who made the decisions in the summer of 1914 were not irrational. They were not stupid. They were acting rationally within a system that had been constructed over decades by the interaction of industrial capitalism, imperial competition, and great power politics. The tragedy is not that they were blind. The tragedy is that they could see perfectly well what they were doing, and they did it anyway because within the logic of the system, it made sense. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. Four empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, had been destroyed. Nearly 20 million people were dead, soldiers and civilians. Another 21 million were wounded. The economic cost was staggering. Britain alone spent approximately $35 billion on the war, a sum that would take decades to repay, and that fundamentally altered Britain's position in the global financial system. France lost approximately 10% of its active male population. Germany was saddled with reparations that would poison European politics for a generation and help create the conditions for an even more devastating conflict just 20 years later. And the arms manufacturers? They did fine. Krupp survived. Vickers survived. The banks survived. The systems that had created the conditions for the war were not dismantled. They were merely restructured, rebranded, and set loose to create the next catastrophe. The true origin of the First World War is not a story about a single bullet in Sarajevo. It is not a story about alliance systems and mobilization timetables. It is a story about what happens when economic competition between great powers is allowed to escalate without restraint, when the interests of capital become indistinguishable from the interests of the state, when the machinery of war becomes so profitable that peace becomes the enemy of progress. It is a story that did not end in 1918. It continued through the 20s and 30s, through the Second World War, through the Cold War, and it continues today in different forms, in different theaters, but with the same underlying logic. The next time someone tells you the First World War was started by an assassination in Sarajevo, remember this: the assassination was real, the alliances were real, the mobilization timetables were real. But none of those things explain why 65 million men were mobilized to fight a war that none of them wanted. To understand that, you have to follow the money. You have to look at who profited, who invested, who built the weapons, who financed the railways, who carved up the colonies, and who decided that the only way to settle the question of who would dominate the 20th century was to drown a generation in blood. That is what most historians get wrong. Not the facts, the emphasis. They tell you the what and the how, but they rarely tell you the why. And the why, as always, is money. If this story changed the way you look at the hidden forces that drive global conflict, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. We are dedicated to unearthing the history that they have tried to bury. Join us as we continue to explore the truth behind the headlines. Let's plant the seeds for a more informed future together. The next treasure of history will be revealed very soon.